In the early hours of Saturday, January 3, 2026, reports of multiple explosions and low-flying aircraft over Caracas triggered a fast-moving security and diplomatic situation in Venezuela. Residents in several neighborhoods described loud blasts around about 2 a.m. local time, followed by the sound and sight of aircraft flying low over parts of the capital. Video clips posted online showed flashes and smoke, though not all footage can be independently verified. What multiple outlets have corroborated is that at least 7 explosions were reported, and that low-flying aircraft activity was observed in connection with the incident. Venezuela's government quickly framed the event as an external attack. Officials accused the United States of carrying out strikes against civilian and military installations in multiple states, including Caracas and nearby coastal and central regions. State communications described the incident as military aggression, and government representatives said the attacks hit or affected sensitive sites. International reporting referenced smoke rising from an area linked to a military base hangar at La Carlota, and power outages were reported near another installation, including disruptions in the southern part of Caracas near a major military base. These details, while still developing, were consistent across multiple independent reports and official statements cited by major news agencies. Euronews, the United States, at least publicly, has not provided a detailed confirmation of direct involvement. Early reporting noted that both the White House and Pentagon declined to comment or redirected questions, leaving a gap between Venezuela's accusations and an official U.S. position on what occurred, why, and under what authority. That absence of a definitive public statement has contributed to uncertainty and competing narratives, especially online. In practical terms, however, the situation was treated as serious enough for immediate risk management steps by aviation authorities. The U.S. Federal Aviation Administration issued a notice to airmen restricting U.S. commercial and private flights over Venezuela and nearby Curaçao due to safety risks associated with military activity. On the ground in Caracas, the first hours after the blasts were marked by confusion and heightened anxiety. Witness accounts described people moving into streets and open areas, trying to understand whether the explosions were localized to specific facilities or part of a broader wave of strikes. Some reports indicated smoke rising from structures associated with military infrastructure, while other accounts emphasized the difficulty of confirming exact points of impact in real time. In situations like this, early descriptions often mix direct observation, second-hand reports, and speculation, so the most reliable elements remain those confirmed by credible outlets and official statements. The timing around 2 a.m., the multiple explosions, and the low-flying aircraft activity. Venezuela's leadership responded by moving quickly into a national security posture. President Nicolas Maduro announced emergency measures and ordered the activation of national defense plans, with the government describing the situation as an external disturbance that expands presidential powers. Authorities urged citizens to mobilize and protest against what they called an imperialist attack, while also asking people to avoid spreading unverified claims that could intensify panic. The government's messaging emphasized sovereignty, national unity, and readiness to respond. This kind of rhetoric is typical in high-stakes crises, especially when a government wants to project control and deter further action. But it also sets a political tone that can narrow room for de-escalation unless diplomatic channels become active quickly. International reaction began to form almost immediately. One of the earliest prominent regional political responses came from Colombia's President Gustavo Petro, who wrote in a social media post that someone was bombing Caracas and called for international attention. That public statement raised the profile of the incident beyond Venezuela's borders and increased pressure for multilateral engagement. Additional reporting indicated calls for emergency discussions within international frameworks, including potential consultations at the United Nations. Even without a verified attribution of responsibility accepted by all parties, the mere perception of cross-border escalation is often enough to prompt urgent diplomacy, particularly in Latin America, where regional stability and migration pressures already intersect with economic and political tensions. A key point for viewers to understand is that there are at least 3 layers to the story unfolding simultaneously: the physical events on the ground, the political claims and counterclaims about responsibility, and the broader strategic context shaping how different actors interpret the incident. The physical layer includes the explosions, the aircraft activity, and infrastructure impacts like smoke and power outages. The political layer includes Venezuela's direct accusation against the U.S., and the U.S. government's limited public response at the time of early reporting. The strategic layer includes the long-running confrontation between Washington and Caracas over governance, sanctions, alleged covert activity, counter-narcotics operations, and geopolitical alliances. On the strategic layer, recent coverage pointed to a period of intensified U.S. pressure and military posture in the broader region, with reporting describing expanded U.S. operations targeting alleged drug smuggling boats and increased attention to maritime routes. Venezuela and its allies have repeatedly argued that such operations are part of a broader campaign aimed at regime change, while U.S. officials have described regional actions as tied to counter-narcotics and security objectives. In the hours after the Caracas explosions, these existing narratives hardened, because each side could frame the events as confirmation of what it has been saying for years. That dynamic matters because it can reduce incentives to compromise and increase the risk of miscalculation, especially when communications between militaries are limited or politically constrained. Another important dimension is infrastructure risk. Venezuela's economy is heavily influenced by oil production and exports, and energy facilities are often viewed as strategic targets in any confrontation, whether direct or indirect. Initial reporting referenced military installations and facilities linked to airfields and bases, rather than confirmed strikes on oil infrastructure, but the market and security implications remain significant. Even rumors of attacks on refineries, ports, or export terminals can prompt precautionary steps, raise insurance costs, or disrupt logistics. At the time of the earliest reports, there was no comprehensive, independently verified assessment of damage nationwide, and no confirmed public casualty figures with supporting evidence from neutral monitors. Information flow in this kind of situation is a story in itself. When explosions occur overnight and security forces restrict access, journalists may have difficulty reaching locations, verifying images, or interviewing officials in a timely way. Authorities, for their part, may control information for operational reasons or political messaging. That combination creates an environment where speculation spreads faster than verified facts, especially on social platforms. For viewers, that is why it is crucial to separate what is confirmed from what is alleged. Confirmed elements from major reporting include multiple explosions, low-flying aircraft, smoke seen near a military-linked location, and power outages affecting at least one installation. Alleged elements include the full list of targets, the exact weapons used, the precise chain of command behind the incident, and any casualty numbers not backed by multiple reliable sources. The question many people immediately ask is, what exactly was hit and why those locations? Early reporting referenced La Carlota, an area associated with an airbase and aviation facilities, and also referenced installations affected by power cuts. If the events involved strikes on or near military aviation infrastructure, it could suggest an intent to disable capabilities, send a deterrent message, or demonstrate reach. But without verified official detail from multiple sides, any conclusion about operational intent remains speculative. Analysts usually look for patterns, the timing, the geographic spread, the nature of secondary effects like blackouts, and the sequencing of follow-up statements. Venezuela's government described attacks across several states, implying a broader operation rather than a single localized incident. But the exact number of sites and damage levels were still being clarified in early coverage. From a diplomatic standpoint, two things tend to happen quickly after a high-profile security incident like this. First, governments seek emergency briefings and intelligence sharing behind closed doors, even when they issue cautious public statements. Second, international organizations begin evaluating whether to convene special sessions or issue calls for restraint. In this case, the public call by Colombia's president contributed to momentum for broader involvement. Reports also described a tense atmosphere with the risk of escalation. If both sides maintain maximalist positions publicly, the role of intermediaries becomes more important, whether through regional bodies, neutral states, or back-channel communications. Domestically inside Venezuela, the political implications are also immediate. The government's declaration of emergency measures can expand its ability to control movement, regulate public assembly, and manage information. Supporters may rally around a narrative of national defense, while opposition groups may demand transparency, proof of claims, and safeguards for civilians. In many countries, security crises create pressure for unity, but they also raise questions about accountability and civil liberties. The more uncertain the facts, the more space there is for polarized interpretations. At the same time, many ordinary citizens focus less on geopolitics and more on practical safety, whether there will be more explosions, whether electricity and services will remain stable, and whether daily life can continue without fear. For audiences outside Venezuela, the broader regional stakes include migration pressures, trade routes, energy flows, and security spillover. Instability in Venezuela has already had significant cross-border effects in recent years. A major escalation could intensify those trends, even if the physical scope of the incident remains limited. Neighboring states may increase border security, raise readiness levels, and prepare contingency plans. The aviation restriction issued by the FAA underscores that authorities saw a meaningful risk to civilian operations in the area, which is one of the practical indicators that the situation was not being treated as a minor or purely internal event. One of the central uncertainties remains attribution. Venezuela's government directly blamed the United States, while U.S. officials did not provide a detailed public response in the first wave of reporting. In international crises, attribution often depends on intelligence that may not be released publicly for security reasons, or it may be contested due to political interests. Independent verification can take time, especially if physical evidence is limited or inaccessible. This gap can produce a dangerous dynamic. If a government believes it has been attacked but cannot publicly prove it in a way accepted internationally, it may still choose to respond based on its own internal assessment. That response could be diplomatic, economic, cyber, covert, or military. Each option carries different escalation risks. At the same time, it is important to note that even if responsibility is eventually established, the motivations may remain disputed. Venezuela's official messaging described a motive tied to control of strategic resources like oil and minerals. Such claims fit a long-standing narrative in Caracas about foreign interest in Venezuelan resources. U.S. policy toward Venezuela, on the other hand, has often emphasized governance, human rights, and security, alongside sanctions and international pressure. In crisis messaging, each side tends to highlight the motives that best support its domestic and international positioning. The immediate effect is to intensify polarization and make compromise harder. Another element to watch is whether there are follow-on incidents. Many major escalations occur in waves. An initial strike or event is followed by secondary actions, either to achieve additional objectives or to signal capability. In the first hours after the Caracas reports, there were no universally confirmed details of a second wave, but the situation was described as fluid and evolving. Security forces in Caracas reportedly increased their presence and control of key areas. The government's call for mobilization, combined with emergency measures, suggests authorities were preparing for the possibility of continued tension. For a news audience, the most responsible approach is to keep a clear distinction between confirmed facts and allegations, while explaining why the allegations matter. Confirmed reporting supports that explosions occurred. Aircraft were seen flying low. Smoke was observed near an installation linked to a military location, and at least one area experienced power disruptions. Venezuela's government has publicly accused the U.S. of attacks across multiple states, while U.S. agencies have not confirmed involvement publicly and declined detailed comment in early coverage. Aviation authorities took protective action by restricting flights due to military activity risk. Regional leaders reacted publicly, adding diplomatic pressure. These are the core verified points that define what is known at this stage. Beyond those points, much remains uncertain. Exact targets, extent of damage, whether any civilians were killed or injured, what munitions or platforms were used, and whether further incidents will follow. As more information emerges, the credibility of claims will depend on evidence, consistency across sources, and whether independent observers can corroborate details. In the coming hours, audiences should watch for official briefings by Venezuelan authorities that provide specific site names, photos, or videos with verifiable geolocation and timelines that can be cross-checked. They should also watch for any formal U.S. statements that clarify whether the U.S. was involved, and if so, what the stated rationale would be. If international organizations become involved, that could also shape what information becomes available. Calls for an emergency UN Security Council discussion, for example, can lead to formal presentations and statements by multiple governments, which can either clarify or further complicate the narrative depending on political alignments. Even if such sessions do not produce immediate agreements, they can create diplomatic space for de-escalation, especially if influential states pressure both sides to avoid further confrontation. From a purely operational perspective, the presence of low-flying aircraft is significant because it implies either air operations, air defense responses, or heightened aerial security. But again, without confirmed details, it is not possible to state definitively what the aircraft were doing, who controlled them, or whether they were part of an attack or a defensive posture. In many situations, aircraft may be used for reconnaissance, signaling, or rapid response, even if they are not delivering strikes. The fact that multiple independent reports noted low-flying aircraft suggests it was a prominent feature of the event that residents and journalists observed. Another point that often gets overlooked is the risk of misinterpretation in the early hours. Explosions can result from different causes, including sabotage, accidents, internal conflict, air defense activity, or external strikes. Governments and media tend to converge on the most politically salient explanation, but investigators on the ground often need time to examine debris, determine blast signatures, and confirm entry angles or fragments. In the first phase of this story, the dominant official narrative from Caracas was external attack, and major outlets reported that accusation as a central fact of the political response. Whether technical evidence will be released and whether it will be accepted internationally remains unknown. In the near term, citizens in Caracas and elsewhere in Venezuela face practical uncertainties. Even a short-lived incident can lead to tightened security, temporary disruptions to public services, and increased fear. If the government expands emergency powers, this can also affect communications, travel, and public gatherings. Those impacts can be felt regardless of whether further violence occurs. Governments and aid organizations often urge calm and accurate information sharing during such periods because panic and misinformation can create additional harm. For the international community, the crisis highlights how quickly long-running geopolitical tensions can produce a sudden security event. It also underscores how difficult it can be to manage escalation when public statements are hardened and official communications are limited. If the United States remains silent publicly while Venezuela continues to accuse it, the diplomatic environment can become more volatile, especially if Caracas takes steps it describes as defensive but that others interpret as provocative. Conversely, if Washington issues a more detailed statement that may either reduce uncertainty or, depending on content, intensify the confrontation. As this story develops, there are several key signals that will indicate the likely trajectory. One signal is whether verified images of damage appear from multiple unrelated sources, which would help confirm target locations and severity. Another is whether there are credible casualty reports from hospitals, NGOs, or international agencies. A third is whether aviation and maritime warnings expand, which would suggest continued risk. A fourth is whether any government announces retaliatory measures or military mobilizations beyond routine security increases. Finally, the tone of diplomatic statements matters. Language focused on investigation and restraint suggests a possible path to de-escalation, while language focused on punishment and inevitability suggests escalation. At this hour, the situation remains unresolved and politically charged. The most accurate summary is that multiple explosions were reported in Caracas around 2 a.m. Local time, low-flying aircraft were observed, smoke was seen near at least one military-linked area, and power disruptions were reported near installations. Venezuela's government accused the United States of attacking multiple sites and announced emergency measures, while U.S. authorities did not provide a detailed public response in the first round of reporting. Aviation regulators moved to limit flight risk. Regional and international attention increased quickly, with public statements from neighboring leaders and calls for global monitoring. What happens next depends on whether further incidents occur, whether independent evidence clarifies responsibility, and whether diplomacy can slow the momentum of escalation. For now, audiences should expect rapid updates, competing claims, and shifting details. The priority for reliable reporting is verification, confirming locations, confirming impacts, and confirming statements with documentation. Until that verification becomes broader and more detailed, the story should be reported with caution, emphasizing what is known, what is alleged, and what remains unconfirmed.